education company. I had just started my own cloud-based education company, so I thought I better find out what she does. Well, she told me that her company was taking flashcards, you know those cards that have a question on one side and the answer on the other, and turning them into an app for smartphones. Now, those of you who know about my work know that I do not place much value on memorization, so I almost rolled my eyes. I managed to stay polite, however. It turned out that earlier that week, I had attended a talk at Harvard by a psychologist from Washington University by the name of Ruddy Roedinger, who studies memory, and in particular, who studies how much information is retained if you study with flashcards. In 2010, he published a paper in Science which got a lot of coverage in the press all around the world. Because he showed that if you study using flashcards, you retain the information quite well for a few days, but if you take students and you have them study with flashcards, and then you wait 1 week and test them, they only retain 35%. If you wait another week, you can barely measure what is retained. I thought she should know that. So I grabbed my iPad out of my briefcase and I pulled up the paper in Science that shows the decay of memory. Good retention for 3 days, 35% after 1 week, and almost nothing after 2 weeks. She took my iPad. She looked at it for no more than 10 seconds. And then she handed me the iPad back. And she looked me right in the eyes. And she said, "But we only guarantee that they will pass the test." I never thought about it that way. But it reminded me of something that had happened a few years earlier. My oldest daughter studied at Harvard. I thought, that's great. I can tell her all about how to best study, how to get the most out of her education. I can assure you that the term flashcard never appeared in our discussions. But I remember that one Monday morning, we were both driving back to campus. She was sitting in the passenger seat next to me. And as I was driving, I looked over my shoulder. And there she was, sitting with flashcards. And I said, "Natalie, what are you doing there?" And she said, "Dad, I have to know all these amino acids." I said, "I have an app for that. Seriously, some of my work is in biophotonics, and occasionally I need to know the amino acids, but I simply don't use that often enough to remember it, so I just look it up." And she looks at me and she says, "Dad, I'm not allowed to use the app during an exam," which suddenly made me realize that even students who have the best of intentions are forced into study habits that might ultimately not pay off. I've traveled around the world bashing the lecture as an outmoded approach to teaching, focusing on the transfer of information. Somebody once described the lecture as a process whereby the lecture notes of the instructor get transferred to the notebooks of the students without passing through the brains of either. And that's pretty much what happens in most lectures in an educational setting. But that's not what I'm here to talk about. That's not what I'm here to give you a lecture about. I want to turn to the output end of education. And my claim is just as many lectures focus on the transfer of information and not the transfer of knowledge, so do our assessment practices focus on the transfer back of information from students to a piece of paper, usually of just memorized information or on the rote application of memorized procedures. And consequently, our assessment practices, rather than developing 21st century skills, really focus on classifying and ranking people. And I will make the point that we are not able to predict who is going to do well in society and who is going to fail. Taken as a whole, there is an incredible contrast between education and the workplace in any type of organization. Think about it. Education is mostly focused on content. What matters in the workplace is not content, because we have content available everywhere. It's skills that matter. Education is completely focused on the individual. Yes, students come together and sit next to each other in a class, but they don't interact. So they might as well sit alone listening to their professors. And then we assess them and we separate them from each other and cut them off from any source of information. So it's all focused on the individual, sometimes even with individuals competing one another. Then we send our students into society where they're never going to work alone. They're going to work in teams, and they lack the collaborative skills that make organizations successful. Education is mostly a passive affair, where students are passive recipients of information, whereas workplaces are by nature active. Education is focused on procedural learning, whereas what matters in the real world is open-ended problem solving. Problems that students have not seen before. So my talk has three parts. In the first part, I'd like to briefly talk about assessment. Why do we have assessment in education? And what is the purpose of assessment? And I'm going to ask you to work together with the people at your table to answer a question that I will pose you. Then I want to talk briefly about a number of problems I have identified in our assessment practices in higher education, or in education more generally. And finally, because I don't want to end on a negative note, I would like to discuss a few possible improvements to our assessment practices. So here's the first part, and you only have 2 minutes for that. I want you to talk to the people at your table and make a list of as many different purposes of assessment you can think of. You have 2 minutes, and you better have at least 5 items on your piece of paper. So go ahead, 2 minutes. Make a list of all possible purposes of assessment you can think of. Go ahead. The clock is ticking. Talk to each other.
Eu estou anotando. Primeiro, um efetivo aprendizado, né? Que é o que vocês têm.
A mensuração, né?
Segundo,
Conteúdo, não?
a capacidade de
Conteúdo, não?
compreensão.
Não, mas
Conteúdo.
é conteúdo. Você está
Compreensão
avaliando
do
conteúdo. Conteúdo. Eu acho que o foco é conteúdo nos processos de avaliação.
É medir, né?
Ranquear. Eu acho que medir é errado. É ranquear. Uma prova, ela ranqueia. Acho que ela não mede.
E eu
Avaliação
acho
por
também-
competências
Ranqueia
mede.
é no sentido do todo. A medição ela é individual, minha.
Mas olha só, por
Não.
exemplo.
É um ranking. Você não está medindo uma pessoa, você está medindo um grupo de pessoas.
One
Esse que é o
minute
problema.
left.
Acho que esse que é o problema.
And you have to have at
Tem a
least 5
capacidade da
items.
pessoa de resolver pelo menos no direito, né? De resolver de uma forma inovadora um determinado problema que já vem sendo resolvido de uma forma. Por exemplo, você tem um conflito de interesses que reiteradamente é resolvido de uma forma só. Apresenta uma solução diferente para mim. Como que isso poderia ser resolvido de uma outra forma? Então, talvez a criação de uma nova solução, repensar criatividade.
Lembra lá da taxonomia de Bloom, né? Avaliar, criar, interpretar.
Interpretação.
Interpretação, julgar.
Interpretação e julgar. Interpretação e julgamento.
Dentro da taxonomia seria o mais alto.
Não, criar é o mais alto.
Okay, time is up.
Mas eu acho que julgar e
So
criar
I've
estão na
done this
mesma categoria.
exercise with many different audiences, and if I had the time, I would ask some of you to give me the reasons. One that I hear almost always is because we've always done it. And that is as much as people think about assessment in many educational settings. I'll show you my own list, and this list is by no means complete. It's to rate and rank students. She's the best, he's the next student, and so on, to come up with a ranking.
É isso aí.
To rate the professor and the course. To motivate the students to keep up with the work. If we would not have assessment, they would not do anything. Well, think about small children. We don't give them any assessment or exams, and they learn a lot. So I think there's already a big problem with that statement. To provide feedback on the learning to the students. To provide feedback to the instructor. It's a way for the instructor to find out, did I do a good job or not? To provide instructional accountability. And to improve the teaching and learning. I'm sure that most of what you wrote on your list is represented on my list. Now, just look at that. How can we accomplish all of these things with one type of educational activity? But the problems with assessment actually go much deeper than that. I've already said that most assessment tends to be inauthentic, regurgitation of memorized information or memorized procedure. But I would say that even assessment, let's say exams, that claim to test problem-solving skills do not do so. They test what I would call inauthentic problem-solving skills. And I'm not referring to the simple regurgitation of meanings or definition. No. Let's think for a moment what a real problem is. If you have a real problem in your daily life, or in your profession, or whatever, you typically know what the desired outcome is. The problem is, how do you get to that desired outcome? That is the part that is unknown. You're a doctor in an emergency room. A patient is being brought in on a stretcher. You can immediately see that the patient is not in a good shape. You have very little time to reach the desired goal, which is get this patient well and live out of the emergency room. Same if you're the CEO of a company. You have a product, you want to make the product successful. The outcome is no successful product. The question is, how do you get there? Any type of daily life problem, large or small, fits that pattern. You're entertaining guests at home. You're baking a cake. You run out of flour. You got a problem. How do you solve that problem? You know what the desired outcome is, to have the cake ready when your guests arrive. Any real-world problem fits that pattern. How do we test our students, especially in the sciences? Well, we give them what we call a problem, and in that problem, they have to apply a known procedure to find an unknown answer. And they're evaluated completely on that answer. And as my work and that of many other people has shown, many students can solve problems like this by pure memorization of the procedure without understanding at all what they're doing. It's particularly interesting to put this in light of a taxonomy of thinking skills developed by an American psychologist in the mid-20th century, in the
Pensamento
1950s,
de habilidade?
by, we need to go one more forward,
Ah, é a taxonomia de
developed to describe the different thinking skills from lower order thinking skills at the bottom to higher order thinking skills at the top. So all the way at the bottom is remembering facts. You know, World War II ended in 1945. The sky is blue. If I drop something, it falls down to the earth. That's memorization. The next one is understanding the connections between different facts. Then applying, taking what you've learned in one context and apply that to a different context. Have you ever tried that with your students? They tend to resist that tremendously. If I try to give my students, even at Harvard, a problem that is in a totally different context from the one in which they learned, they'll say, "Professor, we've never done a problem like this before." I'm sure you recognize some of your own students there. Well, my answer is, if you had done a problem like this before, it would by definition no longer be a problem. Then there's analyzing. What knowledge do you need to solve a particular type of problem? Evaluating, determining whether the solution you come up with is a viable one or not. And all the way at the top is that elusive creativity, innovation, the creation of new knowledge. Well, as I already said, we barely get to level 3 with our students. And to show you how that relates to the way we assess our students, I want to present to you a little problem that I encountered and then slowly turn that into what I would call a standard assessment question. A couple of years ago, I needed something from a store in Harvard Square near our university. So I took my car and I drove to Harvard Square. It was a Saturday morning. And Saturday mornings, it's always really hard to park a car in Harvard Square. And I typically park my car underneath a hotel called the Harvard Square Hotel, which has a public parking garage at street level, bounded by 2 streets. Mount Auburn Street on one side, I forgot the name of the other street on the other side. 20 spaces on one side, 20 spaces on the other. Typically what I do is I go from Mount Auburn Street into one half, and of course there's never a space, so I pull out into the other street, into the traffic, and then back into the other half with 20 spots, and then back into Mount Auburn, and then back here, and I keep going around, and then at some point you see a person with keys who starts walking towards a car, and you say, "Oh, I'm going to get a spot," but then you notice that the person goes to the other half of the garage, you quickly go out into the street, and there's another car that just comes in front of you and takes that spot. So that Saturday, I said to myself, you know what? I'm just going to stay on one side and forget about the 20 spaces on the other side. Turn the engine off, and this way I can be sure that nobody can take any of the spots in front of me on this half where I am. And as I turned the engine off, I thought, how long is it going to take before somebody comes and frees up a spot? And I, crazy physicist that I am, thought about it for 30 seconds, and then I calculated it was 3 minutes. So I looked at my watch. You know what? 3 minutes later, somebody came and freed up a spot. I felt so good. Now, imagine that we turn that little problem into an examination problem. On a Saturday morning, pardon me, my slides are not forwarding here at the bottom. I don't know. There we go. On a Saturday afternoon, you pull into a parking lot with unmetered spaces near a shopping area. You circle around, but there are no empty spots. You decide to wait at one end of the lot where you can see and command about 20 spaces. What does this problem require? It requires making assumptions. It requires developing a model. It requires applying that model. In terms of Bloom's taxonomy, we're all the way at the top. Now suppose we take this problem and we put it on the exam of one of one of our courses, I promise you, your students will go to your dean to try to get you fired. Because there's no way they can do a problem like this. Among the skills that are listed here, assumptions, developing a model, applying that model, which is the one that students hate the most? Making assumptions. What if they make the wrong assumption? You know, they never realize that you can always revisit an assumption. But what is it that makes an individual successful in later life? What is it that makes one doctor better than another doctor? Or one engineer better than another engineer? Or one investor better than another investor? Or one politician better than another one? It's the ability to make assumptions. But anyway, since we don't want to get fired, let's take this problem and change it so that they do not have to make an assumption. We add one sentence. On average, people shop for 2 hours. 2 minutes is too short, 2 days is too long, so 2 hours is sort of right in the right ballpark. So now we've removed the assumption. We're still pretty high in Bloom's taxonomy. And still, I'm sure that students would be horrified. What does this have to do with physics or chemistry or biology or whatever? So let's take the next level out. We're going to take the model out. Suppose that people leave at regular intervals. Now we have taken everything out of the problem. We've put everything that the students need to know in the problem. In terms of Bloom's taxonomy, we're quite far down now, all the way to applying. And still students would be horrified. Professor, we've never done any parking lot problems before. Okay, let's now take this and make one more change to turn this into a regular assessment or textbook problem that we might give to our students. Here we go. On a Saturday afternoon, you pull into a parking lot with unmetered spaces near a shopping area where people are known to shop on average for 2 hours. You circle around, but there are no empty spots. You decide to wait at one end of the lot where you can see and command about 20 spaces. How long do you have to wait before someone frees up a space? And I can already hear you think, isn't that the same problem that we started out with? Yes, but somewhere in the course of instruction, the students have seen and learned and memorized this equation, colloquially known as the parking lot equation. The amount of time you have to wait is the amount of time that people shop on average divided by the number of spaces. And all that is left to do is use a calculator. And now we're all the way at the bottom of Bloom's taxonomy. We've taken a problem that requires creativity and is interesting and turned it into something that can be done by a robot. And I think that's particularly important because, let me go one back. I think that's particularly important because computers can do this type of problem solving. And I predict that just as assembly line jobs have been eliminated by robots, so will any job that requires memorization or the application of road procedures be eliminated by the devices that we carry in our pockets. However, there's a problem by focusing on real problem solving. And that problem is that our assessment practices discourage this type of problem solving. And any type of real problem solving is not solved in a straight path. You might try one approach, and What is so peculiar about it is the sense of isolation. Every student is alone. They don't have any modern device on their table. They're not allowed to have a calculator, they're not allowed to have a telephone or a computer, nothing. I recently read in the New York Times that students who are taking the advanced placement at Yale, you should have known that by heart. I can look up whatever I want and talk to whoever I want when I do my work. How can we imagine that what we measure in a situation like this tells us how people are going to perform in society? They're never going to work like that. Traditionally also, assessment has focused on final exams, high-stakes exams. But the problem with high-stakes exams is that it promotes cramming, and as I've already mentioned, cramming promotes short-term memory storage, and therefore there is neither transfer nor any retention. And then there are some other things I briefly want to discuss. The first thing is grades. Research in the UK has shown that if you take the grade away from an assessment, if you just have feedback, this is good. You may want to think about this again. What about this? So you give students feedback rather than telling them this is a 9 out of 10, or this is a B, or this is a 6. In that case, students actually focus on the feedback rather than the grade. But as soon as you put, in order to improve their learning, but as soon as you put grades on there, they ignore the feedback. It's only about the grade and about maximizing the grade they want to get. Then there's another problem. The assessment really produces a conflict. I started to realize that when I completely radically changed my approach to teaching and moved from traditional teaching to team-based projects in my course. So during the year, I'm the coach. I'm helping my students build the best possible project. At the end of each month, we have a project fair where the students show their projects. And the first year that I did this, on the project fair, I would be the judge. And I realized I had a problem. It was very difficult for me to switch from being a coach to being a judge. I'd seen how hard all these students are worked. I wanted to give them all an A's. It was really hard to make that transition from good guy to bad guy. Think about it. How can we get away with that? How can we get away with being both the coach and the judge? I don't think that there is any other human activity where it is tolerated that the coach is the judge. Imagine I'd be coaching somebody for the Olympics. And then we go to the Olympics and I say, do your best, and I'm going to be the judge. It would be unacceptable. It would be unacceptable. How do we get away with that in education? I mean, the more I think about it, the more I think that education is one big cartel. So, how do we get away with it? I thought about it deeply, and I think I know. We get away with it by hiding behind a thin veil of objectivity. I'm going to evaluate you completely objectively. No feelings, no judgment. But think again about Bloom's taxonomy. Which of these thinking skills can be truly evaluated objectively? Only the ones all the way at the bottom. So, in a sense, this objectivity that we're forced into because we do both the coaching and the assessment forces us to only test the lowest order thinking skills, which are not that relevant in the 21st century. And there's more. There's grade inflation. There's cheating. Why would somebody interested in learning cheat? A lot of my colleagues say cheating is a problem with the students. No. Cheating is a problem with the assessment. Because by the standards of cheating in education, I am cheating every day when I talk to other people and when I look up things on the internet. So, let's move on to how to improve in these last 20 minutes or so. My first recommendation would be, let's mimic real life. Let's educate the students the way we expect them to function in society, in an organization. Let's give them access to information during an exam. You know, when I started teaching at Harvard, which is already quite a while ago, I was asked to teach physics to pre-medical students. Okay, that's not an easy course to teach because these students do not want to learn physics. In fact, they hate physics even before coming into the classroom. And I was thinking, how am I going to assess them? And I was thinking, is it important for these future doctors to just remember all these physics equations? So I thought, you know what? I'm going to prevent them from having to memorize the equations. I'm giving them a sheet that has all the important equations. That was year one. So I sort of intuitively already felt that it was pointless to make students memorize information. The second year, some students who had seen the equation sheet from year one came to me and they said, rather than having your equation sheet, could I make my own equation sheet? I thought about it, and then I said, okay, you can take one index card, one side only, to write equations on. Only to discover that students develop microscopic handwriting and they put the entire textbook on one side of an index card. So the next year I said, you know what, just bring the book to the exam. And then the following year, something amazing happened. A student came to me and said, in high school, I had another physics textbook, not the physics book that you use in your classroom, and I like that book very much. Can I bring that book to the exam? And I thought about it, and I thought, okay, why not? I realized that if I let one student bring his or her textbook from high school, I had to really permit any textbook. So I said, you know what? You can bring any book you like to the exam. Some students came in with, you know, a stack this high of books to the exam. And then the next year, some students asked me, can we bring the solutions to our homework and our notes that we took? I said, you know what? You can bring anything you want except another living person. But then more recently, students have gotten smartphones, laptops, and we actually started to assess students on the computer. Should I turn the internet off so that they can't have access to the internet? And then I realized any problem to which the answer can be Googled is not an authentic assessment question. What is it that Google does? What Google does, let's look again at Bloom's taxonomy. What Google does is it takes out that lowest order thinking skill. In a sense, it forces me as an instructor to go higher up on Bloom's taxonomy. Yes, there's a price to pay for that. The price is that I have to Google my own problems to make sure that the answer cannot be found on Google. And every year I have to change them. But that is an investment well worth making, because now I guarantee that I ask my students questions that are higher up. on Bloom's taxonomy, the type of questions that cannot be solved by a robot. I'm going to jump again. I'm going to show you a little video. You have to pay close attention. The video was taken at Bandung Institute of Technology in Indonesia, about 150 kilometers east of the capital, Jakarta. It's one of their better institutions. It's a classroom in the School of Management. I'm not telling you what course it is. After you watch the video, I'm going to have two questions for you. One, what is the course? What is the material? And unless you understand Malay, you will not be able to understand what they say. The second question is, what are these students doing? So maybe the first question is not very fair, because you couldn't understand the text. So I'll tell you what the field is. This was a course on statistics. Have you ever seen students having fun with statistics? Now you have. But now what are they doing here? What is the activity that they're engaged in? Any idea? It's a game. It's not a game. It's a test, exactly. These students are taking an exam. Isn't that a complete cognitive dissonance? How can it be? They're talking to each other, they're laughing, they're cheering, and they're taking an exam? The first time that I encountered this approach to testing, which comes from team-based learning. If you're interested, look at the website team-based learning, one word, teambasedlearning.org. And the first time I encountered it was at the University of Delaware, where I was Phi Beta Kappa visiting scholar, which is an honor given to a number of people each year. And during that year, you travel from one institution to another, you observe some classes, you give talks in different departments. And on my schedule at the University of Delaware was to visit a biochemistry class at 11 a.m. on the second day. So at 11 a.m. on the second day, I walked to the building where the biochemistry class was taught, and I looked up the room number. I went to the room. In the room were 5 or 6 round tables like you have here. No students. There was one professor, who was a big beard, who was putting pieces of paper down on the table. So I walked up to him and I introduced myself. And he said, "Oh, great that you're visiting today. We have an exam." And I thought, why should I visit a class while I have an exam? Anyway, I had not been able to keep up with my email, so I said to him, "Shall I go outside and I can do some email and then we can talk later?" He said, No. I want you to take the exam." I said, "Take the exam? What is the exam about?" He said, "Hemoglobin." I said, "Hemoglobin? I don't know anything about hemoglobin." Anyway, I was not in a great mood, as you might imagine, but before I could protest, students started to come in, and I sat at a table with 8 or so students. And at some point, the instructor said, "You can turn around a piece of paper and start on the test." And I turned around my piece of paper, and they were all multiple choice questions. And I could answer none of them because I had no idea what these questions meant. I was in a really bad mood. I thought I could be doing my email outside, and now I have to sit here silently staring at this piece of paper. What I noticed was that the students had another little piece of paper where they wrote down their answers. 1B, 2C, 3A, and so on. They kept track of their own answer. And after 20 minutes, the instructor came around and took all those little pieces of paper. That was 50% of the credit. And then he put on each table a piece of paper that was like one of these lottery cards where you have to scratch off numbers. 1. This is the one that came onto our table here. But you have to imagine the paint being on all of the little squares there. So the students at my table said, who wants to be the scratcher? Do you want to be the scratcher? And one student says, yes, I'll be the scratcher. And then the scratcher said, I thought question 1 was really easy. I had C. What did you have? C, C, C. Everybody had C. So he said, shall I scratch off C? And they scratched off C. And there was a star behind the paint. And they went, yeah, we answered it right. I looked at this and I thought, can I please go outside and do my email now? But then they came to the second question. And half the table had A. The other half of the table had B. The A's did not want B to be scratched off. The B's did not want A to be scratched off. Because everybody wanted their answer to be the correct one. And all of a sudden they started to argue with each other like a biochemist. Don't you remember in class the professor said that when hemoglobin, blah, 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 blah. They talked like biochemists. It was amazing. Finally, they agreed that B was the right answer. They scratched off B, no star. But here's the genius of the method. If you don't get it right the first time, you can try a second time for half credit. So notice that question 1, they got 4 points because only 1 try. Question 2, they needed 2 tries, so they got only half the credit too. Question 3, they got it right on the first try, 4 points. Question 4, they needed 3 tries. But what was happening that as these students were talking to each other, they were teaching each other. Students would go, oh, yes, yes, you're right, when hemoglobin, blah, 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 blah. They were teaching each other. The assessment was not just a high-stakes test, it was an opportunity to learn. And by the time the students left the room, they were all relaxed and they'd enjoyed it and they'd learned. And you know what the best part is? There is no grading to do. No work for the professor because half the grade is calculated by the students, it's a team grade, and the other half for each individual is the individual grade. So I've adopted this technique in my course. So let's do the way we do in the real world. We give students access to information and we give access to each other. And we still can come up with feedback and assessment. So let's talk about the improvement. This is actually a picture of how I do it. I have completely automated this process, but this is actually a test in my class at Harvard, and you see students talk to each other, interact with each other. So the next improvement is, let's focus on feedback, not on ranking. I would argue that the way we rank students is a complete fallacy. We are unable to tell who is going to be successful in later life and who is not. It's a myth. I can make a long list of people who were immensely successful but who dropped out of college or high school. Some of our most famous alumni at Harvard dropped out. Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg. There's a long list. And then you look at where the most stellar, top-ranked students go, nobody knows. I'm going to show you some data out of my own class. 2 different metrics here that I obtained on my students in my class. On the vertical is the final grade from 0 to 100. On the horizontal is the result of a very different test that was not used in the class assessment, which measures students' understanding of the concept of force. According to the person who wrote this test, anybody scoring below 22 is still an Aristotelian thinker. Somebody who has not even accepted the concept of force the way Newton formulated in the 18th century. And as you can see, some, 50% of my students are still Aristotelian thinkers at the end of the semester. Some did very well. Some did not do that well. If you test professors or graduate students, they end up scoring in the last 3 bins. So these are students in my class who do as well as professors or graduate students. And notice that there's still a broad distribution of grades. Oh, pardon me. Let's go there. There's still a broad distribution of grades. There are some who score barely above 60 and others who score 100%. Look at these 2 students. On the left, the student got an A, which is the highest grade. But that student did not even understand the concept of force, which is necessary to understand any physics. And then the one on the right scored on the concept of force at the level of a professor or a graduate student, but he got a C. Is that objectivity? Or is it an injustice? So let's give up ranking. The second part is let's focus on skills, not content. I'm a big proponent of backward design. The normal approach to curricular design is very simple. We make a list of course content, and then we cover the content in class, and then we have some assessment. But in that case, the course is completely determined by the content. It makes much more sense to put the content aside and ask ourselves, what are the desired outcomes that we want? And in order to formulate good desired outcomes, we have to think of the evidence we're going to accept that we have achieved that outcome. If we can't think of evidence that we can measure for the outcome, we need to re-evaluate the outcome, the way we formulate it. And then last, let's think of the instructional approach and content that will maximize the learning outcomes. In this case, the course is completely determined by the outcomes, but this is the best part. You have already thought about the assessment way before you start teaching. Lastly, we need to resolve this coach-judge conflict. You know what I did in my course? I use external evaluators. I ask my colleagues to come to my course and examine the students. This way they can be the bad guys and I can remain the good guy. Also, this validates what happens in my classroom in the eyes of my colleagues. Think about it. We treat education like an individual responsibility. You teach your course, you teach your course, I teach my course, I go to my classroom, I close the door behind me, and what happens in the classroom is observed only by the students who are there with me. But teaching really is a joint responsibility. This starts breaking down that wall that we have between the different parts of our curriculum. If I had more time, I'd also tell you more about self and peer assessment. It is so important that students can evaluate their own learning. You see, when we give our students their diplomas and they go into the workplace, that's not when learning stops. That's when learning really starts. Living is learning. We learn all our lives. And after they graduate, we are no longer there to hold their hand and to say, this is good, this is bad. They have to be the judge of their own learning. If we can't teach them that, they cannot continue to learn successfully. And we run into all the types of problems that our societies run into. There are many ways to do that. I'm just going to mention one, which is calibrated peer review, which is a system that was developed at UCLA. If you are thinking, how can I teach a course with 300 students and use self and peer evaluation effectively? But there are many different approaches. I see that my time is up, so I want to end with a call to action. And the call to action is really simple. When we think about innovation in education, we should not think about content, and we should not think just about our approaches to teaching. We must rethink assessment. Because if we do not rethink assessment, we will continue to educate the followers of yesterday rather than the leaders of tomorrow. Thank you very much.
Anote isso aí, gente. Essa palavra foi boa. A frase foi muito boa.
Thank you very much.
Oi?
Mazur, you can take your seat here at the
Vocês
stage,
sempre
please.
serão seguidores do
Agradecemos então ao professor pela excelente apresentação e agora nós vamos então ter um painel de perguntas em que vocês também podem participar com as suas perguntas usando o nosso